Good morning, everyone. Glad you're here. I look forward to the new year. I don't know about you, but there's something new and fresh about being able to turn the calendar over and start with ones again instead of 11s and 12s. And New Year's kind of help us to turn our thoughts toward a new chapter in our lives. Let me begin with a Bible verse that I can recommend to you if you are like me and thinking in terms of could be a new start. This could be a new chapter in my life. This is kind of my own personal theme verse for this year. And I just thought I'd begin and share it with you. It's from Isaiah chapter 43. Isaiah writes this: "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing." And in case you're wondering, this is God speaking. "Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." Boy, I love that verse. And this is my hope. And this is my prayer for us this year, that in 2019, God will do a new thing in our lives, in the lives of our families, in the lives of our church, in the lives of our community. Now look at that verse, because in that verse, Isaiah mentions that in order to experience newness in our lives, a couple of things must happen. First, newness can't happen without us heading in a different direction than where we're going now. We can't continue our present path and expect things to become new. Newness requires change. It requires breaking away from our past and heading in a different direction. And second, we can't become someone new apart from God's power. If change were as simple as just making a decision, then we wouldn't need God. New Year's resolutions remind us that we don't have the power within ourselves to bring about a fundamental change in the direction of our lives. Real change, and I want you to get this, real change comes when Christ becomes the Lord and the leader of every single part of our lives. Now, when it comes to handing over the authority of our lives and the parts of our lives to Jesus, some areas of our lives are easier than others. Have you found that out? I have. Everyone has their own particular area of difficulty in giving God control of their lives, but there's one particular area of life where practically everybody struggles to hand over control. And that area is how we manage our possessions and our belongings. Giving the Lord control over our jobs, that's kind of hard, but most people can kind of get there after a while. Our families and relationships, well, that can be kind of hard too, especially if we're really feeling like we're in love with somebody. But if we work at it, people generally get to the place where they can give over control of their families and their relationships to God. But our assets, our belongings, and especially our money, that's the one area of life where most people struggle to let God have control. It's usually the final stronghold to come down in the lives of most Christians. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to focus on this one difficult area of life that's such a stronghold for us. And that is who controls our possessions. The Bible term for managing our possessions and assets is called stewardship. And I have two goals for today's message. First, I want to explain to you in a clear and hopefully understandable way what the Bible teaches about stewardship. And then second, at the end of the service, and I just want you to be ready, I am going to challenge you to become stewards of what God has entrusted to you by giving control of this part of your life over to Him. That's where we're headed this morning. So let's begin with the foundational principles of stewardship. God's plan for how we manage our assets and our possessions come down to what I believe are three foundational principles. Here's the first. God is the owner of everything that we have. That's foundational principle number one. And any accurate understanding of biblical stewardship must rest on this principle. Too many people want to approach the topic of stewardship from the possession of a mental picture of, you know how Santa Claus in those pictures has this huge bag of toys over his shoulder and he's lugging this thing around. That's the way a lot of people picture their possessions. It's like this stuff in this bag is mine. So when the pastor starts talking about stewardship in church, let's put my stuff on the table, let's open it up, and now, Pastor, tell me how much of my stuff am I supposed to give back to God? That's a wrong picture of stewardship. Our stuff really isn't our stuff. It's God's stuff. And what we have is nothing except what God has given us in the first place. You want biblical support for this foundation? Look at these two verses. First from Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For He founded it on the seas and He established it on the waters. And from Psalm 50, and this is God speaking, I don't need the bulls from your barns or the goats from your pens, for all the animals of the forests are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird on the mountains, and all of the animals of the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for all the world is mine and everything in it. And so, because that's true, then why are we even having this conversation? That leads us to the second foundational principle of biblical stewardship, and it's this. We are God's stewards. A steward is a person who has been given the responsibility of managing what someone else owns. Stewards don't own the stuff that they manage. They just see that it is used according to the wishes of the real owner. God appointed us as stewards. First time's appointment came when He created the world. Look at these verses from Genesis chapter 1. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Now listen to what He said to His new creation. He said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. He didn't say these are yours to own. Remember, He said these are all mine. But He placed us here as stewards, someone who looks over and manages what really belongs to Him. And just as God appointed us as stewards over creation, we are also to be His stewards over our personal possessions because those are His as well. What we have belongs to God, and God has entrusted them to us to be managed according to His guidelines. The key here that I want you to get is that we are accountable to God for how we manage His possessions. He has expectations of us in this area of our lives. We are not free to treat God's belongings as if they were ours and not His, because we're not the owners. Dave Ramsey explains it like this. Let's say that you decided to retire and move to Tahiti. Now, I can't imagine why anyone would want to retire and move away from the paradise that is Winter Haven, Florida, but just go with me here for a minute. You're moving to Tahiti, and so you're not coming back. You got to go to the bank and get your money. So you go and sit down with your personal banker and you say, okay, we've made a decision in our life to where things are going to change, and now I need my money. Can you get it for me, please? And your personal banker says this to you. You know, a couple of years ago, my daughter needed braces. And so I kind of used some of your money. And last month, my spouse and I just felt really burned out and tired, and we needed a vacation really bad. So I kind of used some of your money. Now, what would you say to that person? I know what you would say. You would say, wait a minute. That's not your money. That's my money. I just gave it to you to manage and look after in the way that I asked you to do. That money was not yours to spend. That's the principle of us being stewards of what God has entrusted to us. And this leads us to the third principle of stewardship. God's stewardship plan is designed to benefit us. Let me ask you a rather obvious question. Even though God has appointed us to be stewards over His possessions, do you really think He needs our help managing them? Of course He doesn't. So there's got to be a deeper dynamic going on. We get a clue from Matthew 25 in a parable that Jesus told. And here's how the parable starts out. This is Jesus telling a story. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. Okay? They became stewards of what he owned. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. That's him practicing stewardship. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more, but the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. The story continues on that the owner returns and he rewards the stewards according to their effectiveness and their trustworthiness of being stewards. The point being, there is a benefit to us in this plan of stewardship. It's almost like God is testing us. He's testing 2 things in us first. Through stewardship, God is testing our obedience and our loyalty to Him. Stewardship is God's way of revealing whether or not we're serious when we testify that Jesus is really Lord of our lives. It's a litmus test that reveals whether we're doing things our way or God's way. Stewardship reveals who is really in control of this part of our lives. And God is also testing our faith, because stewardship raises an important question. Do I really believe God will come through for me or not? If I handle finances according to His direction, will He be faithful to me in return? That's what stewardship tests in us, our faith. If I volunteer for ministry, if I serve in the community, will I really be of use to anybody? So now let's move along and change our focus from principles to application. Because biblical stewardship is more than just some principles that we ought to know intellectually. It's a philosophy of living that is to be put into everyday life. So let me give you 3 categories of our lives where biblical stewardship plays a part in how we ought to live. The first area, it might take you by surprise, our children and our grandchildren. See, it's easy to forget that our children and our grandchildren are just as much a gift to us from God as our cars and our houses and our jobs and our paycheck. And biblical stewardship involves us recognizing God's ownership, ultimately, of them. 1 Samuel tells a story about a woman named Hannah who desperately wanted a child but could not conceive. She pled with God for a child. And God answered her prayer by giving her the birth of a son. And she responded by recognizing God's ultimate ownership of her son and dedicating him to God's service. This is the story. When the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle at Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. And after sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, the priest. "Sir, do you remember me?" Hannah asked. "I'm the woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and He granted my request. Now I'm giving him to the Lord." Do you see the stewardship principle? And he will belong to the Lord his whole life, and they worshiped the Lord there. You know, maybe you've never thought of your children or your grandchildren from the perspective of stewardship. Pastor Jess and I were talking a while back about this topic of children and our responsibility of stewardship and bringing up our children. And we landed on a question that I want to share with you because I believe it deserves some thought. When our children was born, God equips us as parents and grandparents, as adults, with an instinct to love them, to care for them, to provide for them. So we feed them. We buy them clothes. We teach them to dance. We teach them to play ball. We give them opportunities to grow as people. We don't have to be forced to do that. It's just something that we do out of instinct. We don't call somebody to come over and change our kids' diapers. Well, women don't. Sometimes men do. We don't do that kind of stuff because that's our instinct as parents. Here's the question that we landed on. What has happened to our instinct that drives us to provide for the spiritual help and development of our children in the same way that we provide for their physical needs? Children are spiritual beings, and They have spiritual needs, and it's up to us to see that those needs are met. It's a principle of stewardship. You may be wondering what that looks like. Look at this verse from Deuteronomy. This is just an idea. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Listen to this. Repeat them to your children again and again. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're on the road, when you're going to bed, when you're getting up. Meeting the spiritual needs of our children is not as hard as it might seem. Bring them to church. Pray with them. Use teachable moments in their lives to apply spiritual truths. If you're parents and grandparents in this area, you've got an ally here that you might not have counted on before. Our children's ministers, our children's volunteers are dedicated to the spiritual help of your kids. And if you just reach out to them, they are ready and willing to help you develop your spiritual lives of your children. It's a matter of stewardship. That's one area. The second area is the area of our money. This is probably the most familiar application of stewardship. We'll talk about this a little bit more next week, but let me give you the basics for today. Biblical stewardship teaches us that all our possessions belong to God, and finances is no exception. God's plan for financial stewardship calls for us to give a tithe of all that we earn back to God. The word tithe means tenth. So when we tithe, we give 10% of our earnings back to God. Tithing was prescribed by God in the Old Testament law, and tithing has been a consistent part of stewardship throughout the history of the church. One of the most easily recognized scriptures regarding tithing is Malachi 3, chapter 10. Here's what it says. This is God speaking. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, God says, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. God dares us to take him at his word when it comes to our finances. I don't think this is by accident. See, God knows that if there's one area of life that we want to cling to, it's our money. Our wallets are often the last thing to come under control of God. Many people think about giving only at the end of the month, and only if all of their priority list has been fully funded, and if it's been a good month, and if the church leaders are doing the things that I agree with, then maybe I'll give. There's a recent school of thought that teaches that Jesus' death and resurrection somehow places us in a new area of faith and grace, releasing us from the obligation to tithe. I personally see nothing in Scripture to support this viewpoint. And I believe tithing continues to be an expression of stewardship that applies to us today in the same way that it has applied to the church through the centuries. So there is tithing in the area of our children and our grandchildren. There is tithing and stewardship principles in our money. Here's one last area of life where the principles of stewardship come into play. That's the area of our gifts and our talents. I'm talking about personally. Each one of us, you included, are born with natural talents and abilities that make you who you are. Some of you are talented singers, musicians, gifted writers, teachers. Some of you were born with a heart to serve. These gifts and talents that you happen to have are not accidents. They have been given to you by God. And in addition to your natural talents, everyone who invites Christ into their hearts is given a unique set of spiritual gifts that enables them to minister to others. So what are we to do with these spiritual gifts? Paul addresses this in Romans chapter 12. He writes, in his grace, God has given us, all of us, different gifts for doing different things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, man, serve them well. If you're a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, then don't just sit there, be encouraging. If it's giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership ability, then take that responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. The point here is you have been gifted. And as a principle of stewardship, this is not for our benefit to say, hey, look who I am. You've been given these gifts so that you can minister to others. Your ability to communicate with clarity, that's a gift from God. Go use it. Your ability to encourage people that's going through a tough time, that's not by accident. That's a gift from God to be used for the benefit of other people. And these are only three of several areas in our lives that we can talk about that apply in the principles of biblical stewardship. I think it's a shame that in many people's minds, stewardship equals money, when money is actually just a small part of a life-wide variety of gifts, of talents, of blessings, of abilities, of possessions, of time, none of which belong to us, but all which have been given by God to us to be managed and appropriated according to His plan. God didn't institute the principles of stewardship because His kingdom is going to fall apart without your contribution. God creates money. God has all He needs. This is not about God. This is about us. His kingdom won't fall apart if we don't bring our managerial skills to keep the church running well. It's not about that at all. Stewardship isn't for God's benefit. It's for our benefit. Through stewardship, God reveals whether or not we're willing to follow His directions. It reveals the strength and the depth of our faith. And one last thought about stewardship. I wonder if stewardship might be an accurate measure of our gratitude for what God has given to us. Let me say it another way. Would we be truthful telling people that we're grateful for what God has done if we offer nothing back to Him in return? We begin by affirming that the pathway to a new start in our lives begins by bringing every single area of our life under God's control. And this area of stewardship is often the last and final stronghold to fall. If we want 2019 to really be a new year for us, then these strongholds must come down. Are you ready for your challenge? Now that you've heard the biblical principles of stewardship and what God has asked us to do in the area of our assets, our time, our gifts, our children and our grandchildren, and everything that we have. Are you willing to bring this area of your life under God's control this year? You might not understand all the principles. It's my job to teach them to you. And next week and the next week, that's exactly what I'm going to do. But before we get too far into what all of this stuff entails, there's a decision that we have to make. Are we on board in this area or not? When we hear God ask us to do this or that, so we line up with His will, are we willing to say yes? That's the starting point. And so I just simply want to end our service by giving you that opportunity. Would you close your eyes and bow your heads out of respect for God for just a moment? And I want to be silent for a moment and give you a chance to do some personal business with God. I have no idea who gives what in this church. I never look at the financial areas of our life. I don't know about everybody's involvement in ministry. Many people are involved in ministry outside of our church, so I can't comment on whether or not your life right now is lining up with God's plan for stewardship, but you know, and God knows. And only you know if you are really under God's authority in this area of your life. I simply ask you to take a moment and say, Jesus, are you the Lord of this part of my life? And if not, I want to offer this part of me to you for just a moment. Would you speak to God about this and let Him speak to you? My Father, this is a difficult part for us. And it's against our nature to turn over control of this area of our life. But I pray this morning, because this is a chance to become something new, that you would give us the courage and the faith to say, Lord, my time, my children, my talents, my money, my everything is now under your control. And if you just show me what to do to please you, then that's exactly what I intend to do. I ask this in your name. Amen. Hey, thanks for coming. Before you leave, let me say to you, if you're new here and this is your first time, I'd love to meet you right after the service. We got an area that's called New here out there. I'll be there. Would you stop by and say hello and let me meet you in person? Also, down in the front is our prayer team, or part of them. If you need prayer for you or someone in your life, make your way down, introduce yourself, and these folks would be happy to pray for whatever it is that's going on in your life. I hope you have a great week. I hope you come back next week with somebody, and we'll do this again. God bless you.